In this video, I want to talk about the subjunctive mood. And in NT101 and 102, we've learned the indicative mood and we've learned the participle. Technically, the participle is not a mood, so the subjunctive mood is going to be our second mood that we're learning. The participle by nature is going to be dependent. It's going to be adverbial, so it's going to modify a verb, or adjectival, where it's going to modify a noun. The subjunctive mood could be independent or dependent. We'll talk about what that means, just like the indicative could be dependent or independent, depending on the conjunction that introduces the clause. And so when we think about mood, the subjunctive mood is going to be our second mood that we're going to look at. One other issue that we need to think about in terms of the subjunctive mood is that by nature of the subjunctive mood, all the action of our verbs are going to be in the future. So they're going to be future oriented. So in terms of time, the action of the verb is in the future. And so what does that mean for us for tense? That means that tense in the Greek subjunctive is going to be a little different than what we would expect. When we think about tense as English speakers, usually we think about time, but since our subjunctive mood verbs are going to be future oriented, the time element in tense just kind of drops out. And so what does tense tell us about the subjunctive verbs? Well, the tense describes the kind of action that the verb is going to express. Either it's going to be some type of continuous action or it's going to be some type of undefined action if it's present tense or if it's aorist tense. And so we'll deal with that as we work through the subjunctive mood. When we think about mood describes the speaker's portrayal of reality. And note, I'm making a fine distinction. It doesn't portray reality. It portrays the speaker's, describes the speaker's portrayal of reality. And so what does that mean? Well, the speaker could be wrong. And so if the speaker says, "It is raining outside," and you stick your head out the window and it's sunny, then the speaker is portraying a different kind of reality. So it's his portrayal of reality. Another option is that he might be lying, and so a speaker might be wrong. He might be lying. And so when we talk about mood is what describes the speaker's portrayal of reality. And so really in Greek, there's 4 moods that we're going to see. We're going to deal with 3 of them. We're going to ignore the optative. But each mood is going to describe some level of potentiality. And so our indicative mood, which you learned, is our mood of reality. And so it states specifically what is real. Next is going to be our subjunctive mood, which is going to move away from reality or actuality and start to express some level of potentiality, and so some type of contingency. So if we go back to our sentence, "It is raining outside," our subjunctive is "it might rain outside." And so there's some level of potentiality as opposed to actuality or probability. And then the third mood that we're going to learn is the imperative, which is the mood of obligation. And so one more step away from actuality than the subjunctive. So when you think about mood, the indicative, the subjunctive, and the imperative, think about steps away from actuality or reality. And so our indicative is reality. It is raining outside. Subjunctive is some level of contingency, so it might rain or it should rain. And then the imperative is more of a command, rain. And then lastly, the optative. The optative is somewhere between the subjunctive and the imperative. We're not going to deal with the optative. I think there's probably about 70 optatives in the New Testament as a whole. And so it's really kind of falling out of favor. And so kind of an interesting move in the New Testament. But for us, what we're going to learn is the indicative, the subjunctive, and the imperative. The paradigms for the subjunctive are really, really straightforward, really easy. And so you already know the paradigms. So it's going to be keyed off of the indicative that we've learned. And so with the present tense, we're going to have that lengthened connecting vowel. So it's going to look just like our present indicatives, except instead of the short lengthening vowel with the omicron, we're going to have the short and lengthened connecting vowel. We're going to have the lengthened connecting vowel, the omega. The aorist, we're going to see for the first aorist regular verbs like luo, we're going to get the sigma alpha tense formative. But with the second aorist, we're going to get the unaugmented tense stem. And so, and then one more note here, both the present subjunctive and the aorist subjunctive are going to be unaugmented. And so for these second aorist verbs, you really need to know that the principal parts. We're going to use that third principal part to key off the subjunctive. So the morphology, pretty straightforward. This is our present active subjunctive. So luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, luosen. Note that the first singular looks just like the indicative. So luo, so pretty easy. And so you might be asking yourself, oh my goodness, if I'm out in the wild and I see luo, how do I parse this? Is it present active indicative or is it present active subjunctive? Well, you're going to have to use context. Context is going to determine how you parse that. And we'll talk more about context here in the next few slides. Note here that our 2s and our 3s forms have an iota subscript, so lues and lue. And then note here on all the forms, we kind of have that lengthened vowel. The omicron or the eta, the epsilon is going to lengthen to the eta. So luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, luusen. Just like our indicative and our participle, the present is going to have an identical middle and passive form for the subjunctive. And it looks just like the indicative form, except we have that lengthened vowel. So luomai, lue, luetai, luamatha, luestha, luantai. And note here that our 2s form, lue, looks just like our 3s form for the active. And so again, you're really just going to have to use context to determine, is it active, is it 3s active or 2s middle passive? And so that's really what's going to drive your decision on that. Our first aorist active subjunctive, pretty straightforward. Luso, luses, luse, lusomen, lusete, lusosen. So really, really easy. This is going to look just like our present active indicative form, except we have that sigma coming in, and really it's a sigma alpha with the lengthened vowel there. So luso, luses, luse, lusomen, lusete, lusosen, sorry. And so note here, our 1s form luso, what does that look like? Well, with the sigma and the omega there, it looks like our future active, our 1s future active indicative form. So again, similar form there, but you're going to use context to determine, is this a future active indicative or is it aorist active subjunctive? And usually context is going to help you out here. Note one more thing, our aorist subjunctive does not augment. And so the only verb form that's going to augment is the indicative. And when we get to the subjunctive, we're not going to have an augment on our aorist. Our first aorist middle subjunctive, lusomai, luse, lusatai, lusomatha, lusestha, lusantai. And so again, it's going to look just like our present middle passive subjunctive, except we have that sigma coming in here, formed with that sigma alpha tense formative that we get here. So no big surprise. Our second aorist active subjunctive, note here, this is going to look just like the present tense, except what we have is our stem change. And so we're using that third principal part So lob, the lexical form for lob is lombano. And that's going to be, technically that this would be our first singular present active. Could be indicative, could be subjunctive. Mood. So lombano. And so you have to look for that stem change. So if it's that first principal part, it's going to be present. If it's the third principal part, it's going to be aorist. And so our aorist active subjunctive, easy enough because it looks just like the present tense. You just got to know that stem change. Labo, labes, labe, labomen, labete, labosen. And then note here that we have that iota subscript on the 2s and the 3s form. Our second aorist middle subjunctive is going to function just like our second aorist active. We're using a different word here. So note here we've got our third principal part. The lexical form of our verb is genomai. And so this is our first principal part. Our present middle subjunctive of this verb would be gen with the lengthened vowel, genomai. And note here, so we've got our first principal part. So this tells me it's 1s present, middle, subjunctive, lexical form, genomai, with the short vowel and I become. Here we've got our third principal part, so gen with the epsilon, and so this is going to be 1s aorist middle subjunctive of genomai, which means I become. So tall tale sign that you're dealing with the aorist versus the present is look for that stem change. If you get the stem change, then it's aorist. If there's no stem change, then it's present tense. If it's a regular verb, look for that sigma to tell you that you're dealing with the aorist versus the present tense. So our aorist, second aorist middle subjunctive in paradigm is genomai, gene, genetai, genometha, genestha, genontai. And so that's going to really it's going to look just like your present tense, except for that stem change, gamma, epsilon, nu here for genomai. So you got to know your principal parts to deal with the aorist here. Our first aorist passive subjunctive, look for that theta. That's going to tell you that you're dealing with the passive voice. So that was true when we were dealing with the indicative. And remember, with the present, our middle and passive forms are going to be identical. For the aorist, it's going to have a distinct middle and passive form. So lutho, luthes with the iota subscript, luthe, luthomen, luthete, luthosen. And so that theta with the lengthened vowel is going to tell you that you're dealing with the aorist passive subjunctive. And then last but not least, we have the second aorist passive subjunctive. And so this is going to be essentially your sixth principal part. So grapho, graphes, graphe. Note we have the iota subscripts there. Graphomen, graphete, graphosen. So the paradigms for the subjunctive should be pretty straightforward for you guys. If you know the indicative, this will be a good review for the indicative. The real issue is going to be that connecting vowel. Is it going to lengthen somehow? And then also, just like what we saw with the indicative and the participles, to distinguish between the present and the aorist for those irregular verbs, is look for the stem change. So what makes the subjunctive, or how do we translate the subjunctive? How are we going to handle that? And so the subjunctive is pretty tricky to handle. We could use a lot of slippery English words like would, should, can, may, might. And so remember, when a writer is using the subjunctive, they're expressing some kind of a potentiality, some level of potentiality. And even in English, the difference between I can and I may are a little subtle. And even as English speakers, we may not necessarily know the difference between these two. And so we just keep that in mind as you're translating the subjunctive. We're not going to translate every subjunctive with these words, I should or I would. And so particularly our dependent subjunctive verbs. And so we kind of have to be careful with that. Remember, our subjunctive is one step removed from reality. So we're going to use words like should or might to express this level of contingency. The English should is more like the Greek subjunctive, and the English might is more like the Greek optative. But in our New Testament, the subjunctive and the optative are kind of merging, and the subjunctive is just being used for both. And so a little bit of the subtlety of the Greek language by our non-Greek speakers, or Greek isn't their first language, so a lot of the difference between the subjunctive and the optative are being condensed into the subjunctive. So the subjunctive is doing a little bit of more heavy lifting in the Greek New Testament. So we kind of have to be careful with the subjunctive when we're translating it. In English, this word should could express some level of contingency. So if he should leave his father would die. And so there's some level of contingency that his father's life is on the line if he decides to leave or not. It could express some level of obligation. So I should do so. And so some level of obligation could express some future action. So she realized that she should have to do all her studying before daybreak, or some type of realization. And then some level of probability. So with an early start, they should be here by noon. And so one thing that I just want to highlight in all of our examples here, which is really interesting, is that all of these actions are future. So if he should leave his father, when's he going to leave his father? If he does, it's going to be in the future. If he's doing something that's commanded, when is he doing it? It's in the future. She realized she should have to do all of her studying. When is her studying? It's in the future. It might be in the near time future, but it's in the future. With an early start, we should be here by noon. When are they going to get here? Well, they're expressing this. The statement's expressed from the time point of the morning, and so them arriving will be in the future. So even though these are all future tense actions in English, the tense could be present, could be aorist. And so that tells us that the tense in Greek is doing something different than just telling us the time. And so by nature, all of our subjunctives are going to be in the future because they're expressing some level of potentiality. And so might in English, might expresses some type of permission, liberty, probability, or possibility in the past. So the student might do nothing without the professor's consent, or some type of present condition contrary to the fact. If you were better at Greek, you might understand. And so some type of level. Less less probability than may. So you might get there before it rains. An alternative to ought or should. You might at least take Greek. And so we could still use might to translate these subjunctives. So you ought to take Greek, or you should take Greek. You might at least take Greek, something along those lines. In Greek, really, there are two ways that the subjunctive could be used. And so it could be used as a dependent, and if it's used as a dependent verb, it's going to be introduced with a subordinating conjunction. And so our subordinating conjunctions are going to be hina. So every time you see a hina clause, you should expect a subjunctive. On, which means if, it's going to always take the subjunctive. So there's going to be a number of conjunctions that just demand that the subjunctive to follow. So going back to reference to some of our forms that are identical, like Lusso. If you go back and look at the paradigms, we said Lusso could be future active indicative, or it could be aorist active subjunctive, both one S. And so if it's in a hina clause, if you see Lusso in a hina clause, it has to be aorist because that hina is going to require the subjunctive. If it's outside a dependent clause, it's probably future. And so look for those contextual clues. The second way that the subjunctive can be used is independently. And so really there's no subordinating conjunction. And this is when we're going to translate these independent subjunctives as should or would or might. And then it can express emphatic negation. And we'll look at some examples of emphatic negation. And so our first usage, the dependent use of the subjunctive here, look for a purpose or result, hina. So if we see hina introducing the clause, this conjunction hina, so that or in order that, it's going to give us the purpose or the result of the main action. And so you probably have learned henna. You've learned henna as a vocabulary word, but you haven't seen it a whole lot in the workbook exercises because the subjunctive is required with henna. And so since you haven't learned the subjunctive, Mounts is held off on giving you too many henna clauses. And so now that you know the subjunctive, we'll see henna in the workbook exercises a bit more. And so hina is going to express the purpose or result of the main clause. On or on is going to express condition. And so on introduces this dependent conjunctive clause. If you study Greek, you will do well on the exam. The main clause is you will do good on the exam, and the subjunctive or the subordinating clause is if you study Greek. So on is going to introduce a subordinating clause, and we'll always see the subjunctive in that clause. The third type of conjunction is a temporal clause, an indefinite temporal clause. So eton or eos, on. So whenever, or an indefinite relative clause, hos on. So whoever. And so it's indefinite. That ever in English, whoever or whenever, makes it indefinite. And the temporal marker makes it either a temporal or a relative clause, the relative pronoun. Our independent uses, really there are two types of independent uses, and this is when the subjunctive is used as the main verb. And so there's no subordinating conjunction that introduces the clause. And so if there's no subordinating conjunction, then it's independent use of the subjunctive. And if it's a statement, it's going to be a hortatory subjunctive. And if it's a question, it's a deliberative subjunctive. So it's really that simple. Look for the conjunction. If there's no conjunction, it's independent. And if there's no question mark, it's hortatory. If there is a question mark, it's deliberative. So the hortatory, we're going to translate this as kind of an imperative idea. So let us run. And that sounds very high English, let us run. Today we might say let's run with the apostrophe S. So let's run. But that's how you're going to translate that hortatory kind of as a imperative idea. So let's run. It's less of a command. So the command would be run. But let's run would be more of kind of a suggestion. So I've got a good idea. There's a dangerous animal over here. Let's run. And so it could be something. If you're an inferior talking to a superior, you're not going to give them an imperative. You're going to use the subjunctive here. The deliberative is just a question. So what should we eat? And so a little different than a question with the indicative. And then our third use of the subjunctive is going to be ou mais plus the subjunctive is going to express negative negation emphatically. And so really, really kind of interesting focus here. We got ume, which is our double negative, and then we can have the aorist. So here's Hebrews 13:5. We have ume with our subjunctive. This is our aorist subjunctive. And then we have ume with another aorist subjunctive. And so the rationale behind this emphatic negation is we have the double negative ume plus the mood of potentiality. And so what our author of Hebrews is saying, absolutely, there's not even the possibility that I will leave you. And then for emphasis, he reiterates the thing, and nor will I forsake you. There's not even the possibility, there's not even the potential that I will forsake you. And the fact that he's using the aorist tense makes it even more emphatic, because this is undefined. There's not even a chance that I will have the potentiality of leaving you or forsaking you. And so this ume plus the subjunctive, and really ume plus the aorist subjunctive, is going to express emphatic negation. And it's almost like saying there's absolutely no possible chance that this will happen. It's kind of an interesting way. This is the strongest way that you can express negation in Greek.